It's truly a privilege to be here today. We've been here for the last 2 weeks in Kerala, and today at the Festival of Books and Authors, to be able to meet and speak with so many people here. I have arrived here last week to travel a bit more in the region and see more of its cultures and colors. And that's been an impressive experience, and one that has made me realize at times how very Dutch I am. I am from Holland. And I'm not just talking about having to smear myself with sunscreen every few hours, but how much I am a product of my surroundings, the culture I grew up in. It's moments that you find yourself in a very different environment, that you discover more about yourself. And that's a beautiful, meaningful experience. It's enriching. And in meeting the other, you get the chance of becoming yourself. And that is something that the nationalist movements that are currently rising in many parts of the world seem to be forgetting. Many people are scared of losing their identity when they are confronted with people who are seemingly different, who dress different, who eat different, who worship different. In my own country, Holland, more than half of the political parties now are constantly talking about the danger that Dutch culture will be disappearing. Our traditional Dutch celebrations are disappearing, they say. Our sense of belonging together is disappearing, our sense of community, they warn. Our cultural values are being destroyed, they say, because of migrants with a different religious background. 6% of Dutch society, of Dutch population, has a background in Muslim countries. Most of them are pretty well integrated. Still, Dutch nationalists keep pointing at those migrant groups, at them as being different, as people who do not share our Dutch values. The effect of this is completely counterproductive, of course. By calling someone different, you alienate them, you make them feel different. And a growing group of grandchildren of Turkish and Moroccan migrants in Holland who were born and raised in Holland feel less and less part of the Dutch community, simply because they are less likely to get hired for jobs, for internships, because they are constantly looked upon with distrust every time a jihadist terrorist attack takes place. Distrust creates distrust. You reap what you sow. In Holland and in many other European countries, left-wing parties who see diversity as a positive feature have lost about half of their electorate in the past 10 to 15 years. That's an enormous loss of their traditional adherents. So the question that many Dutch intellectuals, writers and activists are asking themselves is, how did we lose the hearts and minds of so many people? And just from the first impression of traveling 2 weeks here in India, I've noticed that some Indian, and being here at the festival, of course, I've noticed that some Indian intellectuals and writers are asking the same kind of questions. So in that sense, Holland and India is quite, there are quite some similarities. And the questions that I was asking myself, and a lot of left-wing Dutch writers, intellectuals and activists are asking themselves, is this loss of the left electorate to the nationalist parties? Is it because the politics of fear is simply more effective than trust and tolerance? Is it because facts have lost their strength of argument in these times of media circus and controversy? Is it because many left-wing intellectuals and politicians focus on rationality and simply do not understand the appeal of irrational nationalist rhetorics? That is the case in Holland sometimes. Or actually, they don't really want to acknowledge that there is an appeal to an ideology that they detest. It's always easier to despise or make fun of opinions you fundamentally disagree with, but I doubt it's a constructive way to deal with these problems, to actually solve them. Because you cannot defeat what you do not understand. Know your enemy and know yourself. This famous quote from the classic Chinese text of Sun Tzu, it's called The Art of War, in English translation. I have used this quote as the opening citation of my book on Kampf. As a writer who is also an historian, I could not help thinking that in answering these questions I just posed on the rise of nationalism in the 21st century and the lack of opposition to it, we could somehow learn from the past. Last year, I have written a book on the rise of the most notorious nationalist populist movement in history, and the most racist and anti-Semitic one, the Nazi movement of Adolf Hitler. From the very start, the Nazi Party had formulated the goal of purifying the German nation, to get rid of all foreigners living in Germany, especially the Jewish population. And this led to the most horrifying genocide in modern history, the industrial killing of 6 million Jewish Europeans. This was the result of the Nazi Party coming to power. But to try and understand how Nazism was able to get in that position of power, I have focused on the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1920s. I have studied the main source of Nazi ideology, Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf is the book Hitler wrote in 1924. Exactly the period that the Nazi Party was rising from a very small party of not even 500 members to a mass movement of first hundreds of thousands and then millions. I have tried to write about this rise of the Nazi Party in a way that is both historical and hopefully relevant for present day. And in doing so, I've tried as much as I could to avoid cheap comparisons between present-day politics and the Nazi movement of Hitler. Because, I don't know how it is here, but in Holland, it has almost become a custom to compare one's political enemies to fascists, or Nazis, or even to Hitler. And in Holland, this goes for both sides of the political spectrum. The Dutch leader of the anti-Islam party, for instance, structurally compares Islam to Nazism. He literally calls mosques Nazi temples, and he calls the Quran the Islamic Mein Kampf. So that is a comparison, a cheap comparison in Dutch politics to Nazism. But the same goes for the other side. Left-wing activists structurally have called conservative and nationalists fascists and Nazis. So that's ironic. In this aspect, the left wing and the right wing actually act quite similar. They both point to their opponent and compare them to the most immoral and absolute evil phenomenon in history, because that is how Nazism is being used in Europe as a symbol of absolute evil. And it's always the other who shows characteristics of Nazism in Dutch debate. It's never ourselves. All these comparisons haven't helped to enable us to actually learn something from history. They mostly have contributed to an ongoing process of political polarization. It is not even a question of whether all these Nazi comparisons on both sides are necessarily unfounded. There sometimes are certainly worrying similarities. The real problem is that they end debates instead of stimulating debate. That doesn't mean that I am against any historical reference to the Nazi Party, but I do think it's far more constructive to not only point at others and compare them to Nazism, but also have a thorough look at ourselves. Or even more directly, in my book, I try to be honest about which pages of Mein Kampf I myself noticed I was sensitive for. Which of Hitler's ideology I could imagine I would have found attractive myself if I had lived in that time. In writing a book on Mein Kampf that also would be relevant for the present day, I felt this was the first barrier that I had to take, to try and not fall into the trap of cheap accusations, to avoid Godwin's law, so to speak. And the most effective way to do this was to make my own confrontation with Mein Kampf part of the story. The first chapter of my book ends with my intention to read Mein Kampf with as little self-defense mechanisms as possible, forcing myself to overcome my disgust with all its racist sections, or my tendency to make fun of Hitler's simplistic worldview, so I could try to understand their attractiveness and not just judge them. Every time I felt my self-defense mechanisms waking up, I forced myself to reread that page in Mein Kampf. With the same thought in the back of my head, how could those ideas have attracted millions and millions of Europeans? And the first chapter of my book ends with sort of a confession. I recognized more of myself than I wanted in Mein Kampf. Because if I'm completely honest, I have to admit there were certain moments while I was reading Mein Kampf that I could understand the attraction of Hitler's rhetorics. The appeal to a sense of community, for instance, especially in times of crisis and fear. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in the aftermath of the First World War, and that First World War ended in 1918. And the following economic and political crisis after the First World War. I could also understand some elements of the war romanticism, the idealization of the loyalty of a soldier has towards his comrades, the need to believe that the war had an important purpose and meaning, especially when you have lost loved ones and feel the need to make sense of all the grief and suffering. There also have been times in my life that I have tried to give meaning to tragic events that in itself had no meaning at all. They just happened. But the urgent need to attach grand meaning to things that make you suffer, I certainly have felt myself. I think many of us have. So let me start with giving a short quote out of Mein Kampf to show you what I mean. In this quote, Hitler is talking about the trauma of the First World War and all the pain it has caused. But in the end, Hitler says, this will all have served a purpose. This is the quote. Everything on this earth can be improved. Every defeat can become the father of a conquest in the future. Every lost war can lead to a resurrection. Every disaster to the insemination of human energy, and out of every kind of suppression can grow the forces for a new rebirth of the souls. It was sections like these in Mein Kampf that made me realize that if I had been a mother or a father or a brother of a fallen soldier in a war, I probably would feel comforted by the idea that he had not died in vain. This, of course, is very generic war rhetorics. Every fallen soldier now that gets flown back to the USA gets a speech like this. In Holland, the same way. In every Hollywood war movie, words like these are being used. Heroes always die for the greater good of us all. They are martyrs for a greater cause. All religions are full of these ideas about martyrdom. There were more elements in which I could understand the attraction of Hitler's rhetoric sometimes. When he makes fun of the naive ideas of some humanists, for instance, that all people will give up their self-centeredness and egotism once they are properly educated and have a roof upon their heads and enough money. I certainly hope that this is true, but living in one of the richest countries in the world, I can tell you from experience that not all people lose their egotism when they are rich. And as someone who reads the daily paper as a historian, I think that this would not only probably is the case in Holland, but in the rest of the world as well. For most people, a real sense of solidarity is limited to their own group, to their own community, to their own country. Most people in Europe are genuinely concerned about poverty in Africa and Asia, but if they had to choose to give up half their income to end inequality in the world, if that would mean they could not send their children to a good school, if that would mean they could not spoil their grandchildren, in the end, most people would make the choice for their own well-being and that of their family and their surroundings and maybe their country. Again, this is a shame, but I do think that Hitler had a keen eye for people's weaknesses, and this is National Socialism in the broadest sense of the word. You are solidar with your own community. Of course, instead of trying to overcome these human weaknesses, Hitler chose to take advantage of them. Talking about human weaknesses, I thought by admitting some of my own weaknesses, my own sensitivities for ideas that are in Mein Kampf, I do not mean to somehow normalize Nazi ideology. I am not suggesting that anyone who lived in the 1920s or 30s, anyone could have been a follower of Hitler. I'm not suggesting that we should not have a moral judgment about people who chose for Nazism. As a grandson of a resistance activist who died in one of the German concentration camps, that was my grandfather, I feel in no way inclined to do so. But by admitting some of the weak spots that I myself have, I do hope to better understand how Nazi ideology could have attracted millions of followers. And I hope that this approach has a much broader political relevance than just one case of self-examination, because the tendency to distance oneself to what repels us has been so great that it has sometimes turned in history into the same kind of distorted hero worship, the same kind of distorted stories of good versus evil that Hitler uses in Mein Kampf. In the Netherlands, the way that public opinion and even academics have dealt with Hitler and Mein Kampf clearly shows how these self-defense mechanisms actually work. Countless times I have heard historians say that Mein Kampf is an unreadable book, the incoherent babbling of a paranoid, solitary man. And just as many times I have heard people say that Mein Kampf is a dangerous book of an evil mind, and for that reason should be prohibited. Both versions lead to the same conclusion. Do not try to understand your enemy, because he is either stupid or he is demonically so evil that you might get turned under his spell. And these are probably some very simple psychological mechanisms. I think we have a tendency, all of us have a tendency, that we don't want to understand what we think is evil. We rather just judge it. As long as we don't have to try and understand that's what we despise, we don't have to relate it to our own actions. What we cannot rationally understand, we do not have to take seriously. Hitler in that way becomes the absolute other, and he has nothing to do with me. In Holland, the self-image of a cosmopolitan and tolerant culture has turned out to be an illusion. With now almost half of Dutch political parties openly nationalist or explicitly or implicitly xenophobic, we now in Holland have to acknowledge that nationalist and xenophobic tendencies are an inherent part of Dutch society, and probably always have been. We just didn't have the self-knowledge to admit it. And that brings me back to the questions that I asked a few minutes ago. Has nationalist populism all over the world been underestimated the last 20 or 30 years or even longer? Have left-wing and liberal politicians and intellectuals and writers looked on populist nationalists and said, well, this is just the underbelly speaking. This is simply so irrational. I'm not going to dignify xenophobia and racial bigotry with a serious response. But even if the content of nationalist populist ideas are irrational, and they sometimes are, they have appealed to masses of people, not all of them stupid, by the way. And more importantly, we should never underestimate what actually, in reality, is having a profound effect on politics and culture all over the world. In Mein Kampf, Hitler has very distinct ideas on how liberal and left-wing politicians forgot to appeal to common people. Because these left-wing and liberal politicians had become too arrogant, according to Hitler, to understand what common people actually were thinking. And I quote again from Mein Kampf. The broad masses of a nation are not made up of professors and diplomats, since these masses have only a poor acquaintance with abstract ideas. Their reactions lie more in the domain of the feelings, where the roots of their positive as well as their negative attitudes are implanted. They are susceptible only to a manifestation of strength, which comes definitely either from the positive or negative side, but they are never susceptible to any half-hearted attitude that wavers between one pole or the other. It is always more difficult to fight successfully against faith than against knowledge, Hitler continues. Love is less subject to change than respect. Hatred is more lasting than mere aversion. And the driving force which has brought about the most tremendous revolutions of this earth has never been a body of scientific teaching which has gained power over the masses, but always a devotion which has inspired them, and often a kind of hysteria which has urged them into action. End of quote. So what Hitler says here is actually quite simple. Most people do not care about rational arguments or facts, for that matter. That is what this section of Mein Kampf comes down to. People care about feelings. They want clarity, not half-heartedness or technocratic nuance. People are sensitive for passion and the strength of conviction. And whether we like it or not, and I myself do not like it, but I do think that on this subject, Hitler unfortunately had a point. And this point concerns one of the weaknesses of democracy, of how democratic governance in practice often works. In a parliamentary system where more than one party takes part of the government, which I think in theory is the ideal form of democracy, there is an important downside. Parties have to compromise in order to work together. Again, in theory, that is a beautiful thing. Different groups of people have to adjust themselves to each other in order to live together. But at the same time, in practice of government, this pluralism often leads to complicated procedures, technocratic language, and half-hearted political rhetorics, which nobody in their right mind can feel passionate about. And the danger is that if democratic politicians don't find ways to talk passionately about diversity, people will simply not believe them. This is what Hitler noticed of the ruling parties in Germany in the 1920s. And in Mein Kampf, he wrote how democratic parties were simply too weak in their convictions to convince the masses of the people. Because most of the people, Hitler wrote, simply do not understand or appreciate, and I quote again, how persons who claim to strive for completely opposite worlds can shake each other's hands. Common people regard a merciless attack on an opponent as proof of the rightfulness of the attacker, and they feel as if sparing the other is a sign of doubt about one's own rightfulness. End of quote. Now, not many people will be able to read pages like these in Mein Kampf and not associate them with the recent political developments in the world, I think. The sense that there is some kind of crisis in the system of democracy, a gap between the political elite, the established parties, and the common people. There are many elements in Mein Kampf that present-day readers will immediately recognize as relevant for the current political situation. Since the last US elections, since Brexit, since the continuing rise of populist nationalism all over the world, and I've spoke to a lot of people the last 2 weeks in India about the BJP and the rise of nationalism here in India as well, we are all constantly reminded of political insights Hitler already proclaimed in 1924, namely that the most important one, and the most important one of those insights is, politics isn't about rationality, quite the opposite. Politics is about belief. Politics, you could say, is the art of making people believe your narrative about the world, whether you have facts to prove them with or not. In many cases, rhetorical skill will do the trick as well. And it's exactly this feature of being a politician that Hitler examines and even proclaims in Mein Kampf. Hitler is remarkably frank about his own pragmatism. On some pages in Mein Kampf, it seems that he was trying to write an instruction manual for populist politicians. And in a way, he was. One of the goals of the Mein Kampf was to strengthen the position of Hitler and the Nazi Party within the populist nationalist movement in Germany at that time, because there were other nationalist parties. Hitler was persuading these other nationalist parties that his method was more effective than theirs, and that they should join the Nazis, which eventually they did. Lying, for instance, was pretty effective, Hitler blatantly admits in Mein Kampf. He calls it, and I quote again, a sound principle that the great masses of the people tend to be corrupted rather than consciously and purposely evil. And that, therefore, in view of the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more easily will believe a big lie rather than a small one, because they themselves would more easily tell a small lie, but would be ashamed of telling lies that were too big. Therefore, a small part of even the most insolent lie will always remain and stick. Much of the inspiration for Hitler's political pragmatism, and this quote that I just quoted is one of the most pragmatic you can think of. One of the inspirations was the lessons that Hitler took out of the propaganda efforts in the First World War. Hitler was certain that the British war propaganda, that was the propaganda of the enemy, had been far more effective than that of the Germans. Straight from the summer of 1914, when the First World War began, the British had portrayed the German army as a cruel and barbaric, as rapists and child killers. That, Hitler thought, was effective from the enemy propaganda. It was a strong message for the enemy soldiers and the British home front, Hitler believed. In order to defeat such a malicious enemy as the British propaganda would have the soldiers to believe, all measures were permitted. And in this way, the British propaganda succeeded in motivating every British soldier and civilian to keep on fighting until the very end. So Hitler tried to take lessons from the propaganda of the enemy of the First World War, and in Mein Kampf he pleads for the same kind of merciless media campaign, which deliberately would simplify all things to black and white, love or hate, right or wrong, truth or lie, but never have this or partly this, or partly this or partly that. This is a direct quote of Mein Kampf too. And again, another quote. All propaganda must be popular and its intellectual level must be adjusted to the most limited intelligence among those it is addressed to. Consequently, the greater the mass it is intended to reach, the lower its pure intellectual level will have to be. So this is really a marketing strategy, actually. So keep your message simple and repeat it often and work with just opposites, black and white. And while I was reading Mein Kampf, I was often surprised about the shameless, open-hearted pragmatism in the book. Because after all, if you're a politician, isn't it smarter to at least pretend to mean what you say? Otherwise, what's the point of lying? But page after page in Mein Kampf, Hitler brags about his capacity to manipulate people, to convince crowds who at first were disagreeing with him, as he wrote in Mein Kampf, but after a speech of 3 hours, he had turned them into a wild, waving mass that was boiling with burning fury and sacred indignation. Hitler wasn't ashamed about his pragmatic behavior. He was proud of it. In telling these stories, he was looking to connect with voters who felt powerless and lost, and after Germany's defeat in the First World War, there were a lot of them. Hitler was well aware that he wasn't factual all the time, that he blatantly was telling lies if it suited him. The fact was, he didn't care, and neither did most of his followers. The only thing Hitler truly cared about was what he said would be effective. And this, I believe, is crucial to understand the narrative of Mein Kampf. Hitler was completely utilitarian in his way of thinking. For him, all philosophy, culture, and science simply was a derivative of the all-embracing struggle for existence. And interestingly, in Mein Kampf, Hitler consistently uses the Marxist scheme of substructure and superstructure to exemplify this point. And to give an example, it's people who have ideas and worldviews, that's the superstructure, but the people are biological beings. So, therefore, if you believe that your worldview is truthful and should predominate, you should simply get rid of the people who have competing ideas. Truth for Hitler is simply the idea that has lost, Truth for Hitler is simply the idea that has won the battle. History is written by those who conquer. And countless times in Mein Kampf, Hitler compares effective politics with religion. If politics, after all, is the art of making people believe your narrative about the world, then every politician could learn from Christianity in the case of Europe, and how it had managed to shape the minds of Europeans, Hitler argued. And I quote again, "The greatness of every mighty organization embodying an idea in this world lies in the religious fanaticism and intolerance with which, fanatically convinced of its own right, it intolerantly imposes its will against all others. The greatness of Christianity did not lie in attempted negotiations for compromise, but in its inexorable fanaticism in preaching and fighting for its own doctrine." So religion was something useful for a politician. That's what this quote comes down to. If you want to have a very fanatic and following, you should use religious mechanisms. That's what Hitler constantly is pleading for. Let me give another example of that, of how Hitler argued that the Nazi Party should take the shape of a religious movement. In chapter 5 of the second book of Mein Kampf, Hitler opposes any change in the first political program the Nazi Party made. That was already in 1920, but it wasn't really accurate at the time. But Hitler said that that doesn't matter, because it's not about the political usefulness, it's about a religious doctrine. And I quote again, "For how shall we fill people with blind faith in the correctness of a doctrine if we ourselves spread uncertainty and doubt by constant change in its outward structure? Here, too, we can learn by the example of the Catholic Church. It, the Catholic Church, has recognized quite correctly that its power of resistance does not lie in its lesser or greater adaptation to the scientific findings of the moment, which in reality are always fluctuating, but rather in a rigidly holding to dogmas once established. For it is only such dogmas which lend to the whole body the character of a faith." And so, Hitler's pragmatism resulted in a plea for being dogmatic. It really doesn't get any more cynical than that. Hitler's shameless political instincts led him to believe that a political movement, in order to succeed, should act with as much religious fanaticism as possible. In Mein Kampf, Hitler actually unfolds a new secular religion that Nazism should become. And in doing so, he had a keen eye for the Christian background many of his followers had. This secular religion of Nazism that Hitler unfolds in Mein Kampf wasn't Christian at all in its core, but could be best described as a religion of nature, a religion in which God, as a creator, is equivalent to nature. Laws of nature are the laws of God, or providence, as Hitler likes to call them. Resisting these laws of nature in the name of humanism or socialism, for instance, Hitler literally calls the original sin against the intention with which the Creator has designed the world. This is about the scheme of the Nazi ideology in a religious sense in Mein Kampf. Hitler constructed his mythological worldview with plenty points of recognition for his Christian adherents. Most of those adherents had been raised as a Catholic or an evangelical in Germany. So in Mein Kampf, Hitler speaks of paradise, the original state of humankind, the Garden of Eden. And that, in his translation in Mein Kampf, were the times of the tribes. Small, ethnically homogeneous communities populated the world, waged war with one another for the best chances of survival. And this, Hitler continues, was how human progress was achieved. So man could eventually fulfill the purpose of creation, becoming the likeness of God, as Hitler describes it. The strongest, most inventive, most daring tribes, and most importantly, the tribes with the most loyal members, who were willing to sacrifice themselves for the well-being of the community, were the natural survivors in the struggle for existence that, in Hitler's eyes, nature was all about. Only this way, man would fulfill his destiny. That is summarizing the view of the mythical view of Mein Kampf very shortly. And of course, this was a gross misunderstanding of Darwinian biology, in which the survival of the fittest is about adaptation, not conquest. The fittest are the ones who adapt themselves best to their surroundings. It's not about war. The verb is to fit in. Survival of the fittest. But again, Hitler was not trying to be a scientist. He was telling a religious story about the fall of man and ultimately man's redemption. So in Mein Kampf, The fall of man from paradise was the mixing of the races that supposedly took place when the Nordic tribes were infiltrated by foreign elements, among them Jewish wanderers. And that, according to Hitler, eventually led to bastardization. The sin against blood and race is the original sin of this world, Hitler writes, and is destroying those parts of humanity that surrender to it. And so Hitler pinned this original sin as the cause of all the weakness and decadence of modern society that he saw all around him. Those weaknesses had been institutionalized in democracy, Hitler claims, in capitalism, the international stock exchange that was destroying healthy national communities, and of course Marxism. Marxism was dividing national communities into class enemies, according to Hitler. Brother stirred up against brother. And this is the way Hitler explains how the decay of the German people had become to be. And that was especially relevant in the post-war years in the 1920s, because it automatically led to the explanation of how on earth the German nation, according to Hitler, by far the best nation in the world, after all, could have been defeated in the First World War. So, according to Hitler's secular copy of Christianity, at the end of the First World War, the German nation was at its low point in the grand scheme of things. And indeed, in Germany during the 1920s, the sense of crisis was urgent. 1.8 million soldiers had died on the battlefields of the First World War. 2.7 million of the soldiers that did return were permanently wounded or crippled. More than 1 million orphans, 500,000 widows. A quarter of the Germans eligible to vote were veterans of the First World War. That really explains a lot of the attractiveness of Mein Kampf. And then there were the millions of civilians at the home front who had died of malnutrition and the Spanish flu epidemic. And the enormous amount of money Germany had to pay back to the countries who had won the war, the French occupation of the Ruhr in 1923, and the following hyperinflation that had caused devastating chaos all over German society. At the time, Hitler was rising as a politician. The dark, apocalyptic image of a German people threatened to be annihilated didn't seem that far-fetched. Many scared, traumatized, or simply conservative-minded people felt that this was exactly what was happening. And for those people, Mein Kampf offered an uplifting vision of the future. If Germany as a nation would honor the remembrance of her fallen sons, Hitler wrote, the country would be resurrected. So that was the last step in Mein Kampf's mythological narrative, to make the circle whole again. After winter must come spring. I quote again. When human hearts break and the souls of men despair, that is the time whereupon from the twilights of the past rise the great ones, who have conquered need and anxiety, derision and hardship, spiritual suppression and physical slavery, and reach their eternal hands to the disheartened mortals. And woe to the nation that is ashamed to grasp those hands. End of quote. So this is a typical narrative about regeneration, about redemption. And narratives about regeneration are still an immensely powerful political tool. We still see examples of them everywhere in present-day political discourses. Make America great again, to the shortest one I can think of. There's a rebirth going on there. So there's an original state of the country, it has been decayed, and then a rebirth comes place. That is what regeneration is all about. Or think about Vladimir Putin's dream of a great Russia, or how President Erdogan of Turkey legitimizes Turkish involvement in Syria, Lebanon, Azerbaijan, and Afghanistan with the phrase, Where our ancestors rode on horses, we also will go. But the hope of regeneration Hitler had to offer should not be normalized as politics as usual. Not all nationalist politics lead to genocide, after all. Hitler's narrative about the rebirth of the nation cannot be isolated from the hateful allegations with which he blamed his political enemies and the Jewish German population for the disastrous outcome of the First World War. And that was a poisonous accusation, because it laid blame to the Jewish population, which was about 1% of the German population at that time. He laid the blame to the Jewish population for all the hurt and suffering the German people had gone through during and after the First World War. Hitler blamed the Jews for sabotaging Germany's war effort. He told lies about Jewish Germans, that they had tried to avoid risking their lives at the front during the First World War, while in fact there was a higher percentage of Jewish Germans in the German army, a higher percentage of Jewish soldiers who lost their lives in the war. Hitler told lies about Jews all being Marxist, that it had been their intention to overthrow the old German government during the First World War through the Marxist Revolution. That it had been all Jews organizing anti-war demonstrations from 1917 on. While in fact those anti-war demonstrations had been organized by socialist and left liberal parties, which contained more than 90% of ethnically German activists. And these were all anti-Semitic prejudices that already existed in German society long before Hitler started his career as a politician. Hitler took these prejudices and used them to give the German people a scapegoat, an explanation of how Germany could have lost the First World War. And he used it as an easy solution for all the problems ordinary Germans were facing during the 1920s. All the Germans had to do to solve these problems was to get rid of the Jews. In Mein Kampf, he even speculated about how this should be done. And that was violence, extermination. Hitler literally uses the word extermination in Mein Kampf, Ausrottung. The Jews living in Europe should be destroyed with merciless violence, Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf. There's more than enough reason to judge Mein Kampf as a hateful book, to feel repelled by its racial hatred. But it's too easy to keep it with that, to only dismiss Hitler's violent and hateful ideology as barbaric and irrational, which it of course was. But the point is, that is exactly how the socialist and left liberal parties in Weimar Germany during the 1920s thought they should treat Hitler and his party, to ignore them, to make fun of them, but in any case, not take them seriously, not taking the time and patience to convince the Nazi followers that Hitler's arguments were false. And when the Nazi party grew bigger and bigger, there still wasn't enough convincing opposition from the democratic political parties. The political opposition wasn't able to stop Nazism. Eventually, in 1945, Nazism has been defeated, but it was only achieved by military means. During the 1920s and 30s, opposition from politics, media, and the rule of law was shockingly weak. This astounded me the most during my research. So that brings me back to the question that I began my talk with. What would be the way to do it better than the democratic parties in Germany in the 1920s did? How can we resist the strength of nationalism? I have discussed this question endlessly with friends, and one evening one of them speculated whether nationalist populism could not be best fought with its own weapons? What if all nuanced politicians who really could run the country competently and fairly, what if all these fair politicians were to use a bit more war rhetorics? What if they were to be a bit more cunning and devious in their campaigns and present their views more as absolute truths instead of being nuanced all the time? It's an attractive thought, if only because it appeals to a sense of competitiveness. I'm almost done. I hear the crow. I'm getting to the end of my talk. Oh, that's a bad timing. What if all nuanced politicians who really could run the country competently and fairly were to use a little bit more of the tricks of Hitler and the tricks of Mein Kampf? It's an attractive thought because it makes you think of the sensation of a trial of strength in which the civilized underdog finally takes a robust swing back. But politics is not sports. The longer I worked on my book about Mein Kampf, the more I yearned for the contrary, for experienced parliamentarians who would explain with patience why the principles of the rule of law are needed to sustain free society. And maybe occasionally, when the boundaries are deliberately exceeded, erupt in severe and imposing anger. But no virtuoso debating techniques, no tricks, but instead an authentic sense of justice. No smooth, media-trained appearances, but rather wrinkled faces that clearly express pain when a compromise has to be made. I longed for idealists who do not sell illusions. I longed for humanists who really understand people, including their weak spots. I longed for Democrats who are combative in preserving peace, unyielding in their defense of the values that are most vulnerable in times when there is a threat of war or terrorism, openness, international solidarity, and the willingness to stay in dialogue with your opponents. So that was what the study of Mein Kampf eventually did to me. And maybe it's not pointless to compare our present time with Nazism. If Mein Kampf can challenge us to think what we can put up against it, how we can maintain democracy and the rule of law, and look for new ways of making vulnerable values resilient. If it can help us, if Mein Kampf can help us to know our enemy so we can defeat him. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions or queries to the author, you can raise your hands.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. You spoke about Mein Kampf as a dialogue that is promoting nationalism, that has all these tricks and tools. But in the 1920s, the political environment of Europe also promoted this concept called eugenics, which I think at the time Churchill and Stalin were very much for. Do you not feel that maybe Hitler's voice was just the loudest amongst all of them? That today we paint him as a villain, whereas in Europe, the general sentiment was towards eugenics, was towards the mixing of impure races.
Thank you. That's a really good, sharp question. And it's true, eugenics was not only something that Hitler propagated, but also the Churchill, or on the left side of history, H.G. Wells, the British Fabians, for instance, were pro-eugenic. But the difference between Churchill and the Fabians and Hitler was that that they did not believe in the racial, that it was racially, what's the English word? That it was racially, it was set static in race, but it was just people who, from all kinds of races that could be less suitable to, well, to get rid of your society. So it was not racist, their eugenics. And that doesn't make them less dangerous, actually. but well, there is an interesting boundary there, because in Europe there's an ever-going process of being capable of abortion when your children are not healthy, for instance. That is a form of eugenics, of course. And the taboo on eugenics is largely set by the Holocaust. And well, you can imagine that maybe in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it will be less a moral issue than it has been for the last 70 years. But still, there's an important distinction between eugenics and racism, and so that there is one group that should be exterminated and then all problems would be solved. But both of them are highly problematic, I think, or even more, we shouldn't have both of them. Yes?
Yeah. Before the talk, we had a very slight conversation.
Yes.
And it's true that not so much here in Kerala and South, because it's a very progressive kind of ideology they have. Mm-hmm. But in the North, you will find, and I want to ask you, and now it's coming down to the South, they've won elections in Northeast, the RSS, extremist groups of Hindutva kind, and not only in Hinduism, mm-hmm. even extreme fundamentalists of the Islamist kind also have similar neo-Nazi kind of ideology, fascism, close to fascism. Mm-hmm. This is the first question. Did you find this kind of similarity? Second, related to this is, in the North especially, I don't know so much about the South, I'm from Jaipur. Most of the bookshops stock Mein Kampf and display it openly as a popular book for many young people to read. Many management students read it for leadership, for management, tricks, as you say, techniques.
Yes.
And this attraction for power and strong leadership seems to be very important in India today. I wonder what has been your experience. And so it's not only Russia and Turkey, but something happening in parts of India. And not only extreme Hindutva, but also Islamic extremism. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I will start with your second question. The popularity of Mein Kampf in large parts of the world. Well, I think in India there must be another in a lot of Islamic parts of the world where certain groups are very anti-Israel. Mein Kampf is read because of the anti-Semitic parts and because they see, well, Jews as comparable to Israel, and that is one of the causes of its popularity in Afghanistan. It has been popular in very radical groups in Turkey, and in Indonesia it has been a bestseller. So, and the second part of it is, I think that well, in India, you just told me about it, and that relates to the first question as well. I do not know enough about Indian politics to really give an informed answer of the similarities. But what I have seen about the rise, well, the RSS, the BJP. I mean, there are certainly issues with comparisons to be made with regenerational politics. So the idea that there is a pure nation and that there are infiltrants and that you can be a pure nation again, that also is always is a myth, but you just, well, it's an invented tradition. So you invent a tradition of a purely Hindu community or a purely German community or a purely American community, and then you've got outsiders who are disturbing that unity. Those are really important mechanisms, similar mechanisms, because it promises a bright future if only the disturbing elements, the foreign elements in your society are cleansed, are gone away with. So these are very dangerous kinds of politics.
Sir, thank you for the beautiful lecture. But then tell us, what is the difference between nationalism and terrorism? In fact, nationalism and patriotism are kind of idealized in India. We have been taught to be patriotic. We've been taught to love a nation, and where, in fact, I want to make a specific reference to Kashmir, where you find a lot of young boys fighting for their Kashmiri nationalism, for the Kashmiri land.
Yeah.
I want you to tell me, is there really a difference between nationalism and extremism? It could be the extremism that you find in Kashmir now could be glorified if, in fact, Kashmir became an independent, isolated, an independent nation. It could be glorified. Now, what exactly is the difference? And just tell me, sir, if you could find a substitute for nationalism, is there a substitute?
Oh yeah, these are very important questions, because I think you've got. I should actually use the term regenerative nationalism to. That would be the most complete term. That's the nationalism of Hitler and of other parties in the 1920s in Germany. But you also have had also in Europe, and I think in India, nationalism as a liberation movement. When in Europe, for instance, Italy in the 19th century was ruled by federal lords from France and from the Catholic Church, and so nationalism in that sense was something completely different. That was a liberation movement of the people, just farmers getting their own land and their own ruling. And I can imagine, that kind of nationalism is more like patriotism. And you have the regenerative nationalism, which we talked about in the earlier questions, and that is about, that's the kind of nationalism of a nation, a national community that has existed much longer, I think, and which poses that there is a national essence to the country which has been decayed and should be reinstalled again. So and that's a different kind of nationalism. And it's really important, and in that sense, a certain kind of nationalism is almost inevitable in all kinds of politics. I think that's the problem, and we shouldn't not just judge him, but really look upon those special features and look at the boundaries. When does nationalism gets dangerous and violent? And I think those regeneration narratives are a very good way of looking at them. Yes, well, I don't know who said that once, but there's a famous quote of someone I don't remember, but he said, well, probably the best way to create a world community if aliens would invade Earth, then that would be the only way of us looking at ourselves as brothers. That's a cynical thought, but alas, yes, probably true.
Hello. Sir, I think today the world is facing almost the same crisis as we had after the First World War. It's almost not the same. How is that the economic crisis that is in Europe and in America, it is being taken advantage of or exploited by these ultra-racist nationalist forces. And in the elections again, it is the extreme right, the conservative parties who come to power. What happened to the left? Why the left? They could not take this space.
Yes, and you're talking about Europe now, eh? Yes. This has been the question that well, almost all Europeans are asking themselves, because it's true, the left-wing parties almost got, well, have lost half of their following. We've talked with a lot of people here in India about it as well. One of the reasons maybe has to do with left-wing parties in Holland, for instance, having governed very long. So at a certain point, if you govern long enough, people will blame you for everything that is wrong because you have been governing very long. That is one factor. Another factor is that is summarized with identity politics. In Europe, the issue of secularization, of modernization, which mean a lot of value systems are not predominantly, are not self-explanatory anymore. So people have the idea of, well, what is the purpose in life? What is, they feel a lack of a sense of community and they long for it. And well, the left-wing parties have not really addressed those needs. Those are more cultural and spiritual needs, and left-wing traditionally is more about